I'm going to be presenting on deep learning model-predictive approach to neighborhood congestion prediction and control. So I know it's sort of a loaded topic, so I'll first like to break down and motivate each and every component of the title, and then I'll walk you through what I've done. So first of all, I'd like to motivate traffic controls. So everyone knows that congestion is a big problem, especially in big cities. For example, New Delhi, every winter, the pollution causes the congestion, causes a public health emergency. Therefore, we need to tackle this problem. Can controls help further? The chart on the right basically shows the increasing delays and congestion cost that commuters in the US have faced over the years. And if you see, there's a slight downward trend in the later part of the curve. So the hypothesis is that even though the number of vehicles has kept on increasing and we've not built as much infrastructure to keep pace with that, we've still seen some improvement, and a major portion of it can be attributed to better controls being implemented. And therefore, there is possibility of further improvement if we can make the controls smarter. So can we incorporate predictions in controls, and can that help? So this was the situation that I personally faced a few days ago. So I was going to SF on a bus, and there was an accident, and the traffic got snarled. And this can happen anytime. The way predictive controls can help is that as soon as the accident happened, the marginal impact of every vehicle is now higher, because the potential that it can cause a really big traffic congestion is much higher. Therefore, you want to start charging people more at that. But because the congestion or the toll on the bridge remains the same, people keep traveling the way they do, and then by the time you realize that the travel time is much higher, it's already too late. So therefore, if you can incorporate predictions in your controls, you can act much further in advance of where you would in other cases. Now I'm going to motivate why we are doing predictions at a neighborhood scale, and along with this, I'll also motivate why I'm using only aggregate characteristics instead of like very fine-grained individual or link-level characteristics. So, as we know, traffic congestion is a consequence of choices that people make. So people make choices regarding when to leave home, what routes to take, and those at times can lead to congestion. But at an individual level, it's already a complicated decision, whether to travel right now or not, what route to take or not. And if you look at it from the point of view of someone who's trying to manage congestion, they're not interested in the individual level. They're interested in the aggregate scenario, like what's the aggregate impact that is being caused. But if they try to model that aggregate scenario as like an aggregation of each individual or each link, the parameter space is going to blow up, and you need a lot of fine-grained data. So that kind of data invades privacy, and it's hard to obtain. So is there a way in which you can just like deal with aggregate characteristics and still get a measure of how bad a region is in terms of congestion? So that's the motivation behind like using aggregate characteristics and trying to model congestion for a neighborhood. So it's useful because that's what congestion management authorities look for. It's also easier to track aggregate characteristics over time, because suppose one sensor somewhere is not working, you can still get a measure of what the aggregate scenario is. So now I motivate like the method that I'm using, which is deep learning. It's not just the buzzword. It kind of fits very well in the problem that we're trying to solve. So congestion is typically recurrent in nature. So there's daily patterns, there's seasonal patterns. So it should be easy to predict, right? But it turns out it's not, because there's several factors which lead to slight deviations from this recurring pattern. So these factors can sometimes be non-observable, things like queue spillovers or like route choice that people make, and they can sometimes be observable but not predictable, like weather patterns or accidents. So you want a model that is complex enough to incorporate like possibilities of several hidden relationships. So deep learning provides this tool where we can actually build more complex model structures. The other thing is the way congestion can be predicted is because congestion spreads through spatial and temporal correlations. So if you can model these spatial-temporal correlations, then you can predict congestion much ahead of time. So in deep learning, there are specific architectures which are there for like extracting what temporal correlations are and spatial correlations are, and we can make use of that. And then finally, if you look at how a signal propagates through a neural net is made of nodes and links. So the way a signal propagates through a neural net kind of mirrors how congestion propagates through a traffic network. So if you are able to capture that effectively in the model, then you might be able to get a good prediction of where congestion is. So these are the motivating factors that lead us to use deep learning for this process. What other new stuff that we're doing, two key things that we're doing is first that we're depending on aggregate characteristics and we're modeling for a neighborhood and we're using like citywide predictions. And the second is something that like pure ML researchers want to do a lot is we want to check whether we're actually modeling the physics correctly. So we're not overfitting just the data and there we want to bridge the gap between whatever like years of traffic flow theory research that builds the physics behind how traffic propagates, how congestion propagates, how we can blend it with deep learning. So this is the overall pipeline that I'm going to follow. First, I'm going to define the modeling framework, where I just say this is the output that I have, this is the input that I have, is the model that I have to predict. Then I'm going to check whether this model is actually a viable model. And that's where I check two things. First, what I just mentioned is, are we actually modeling the physics, or are we just fitting the data? And the second thing, are the predictions any good? So can they compare to like a relatively simple baseline model? So once we're confident that the model is somewhat viable, at least through simulation, then we want to check for robustness. So we want to check like what if the scenarios kind of favor some other model? Can we still make our model relevant? Can we still keep it? Can we still modify some hyperparameters, keep it relevant? What if like the input is noisy, which is very much possible? What if some of the inputs are missing at some point of time? Can we respond to these kinds of adversities? Then once we are fairly confident that the model is robust, ultimately we want to actually test whether it works or not. So we want to use the predictions to formulate a control strategy, and we want to show that there's quantifiable benefits of it. And that's when we can call it a success. So first of all, the modeling framework. As I said, I'm just going to define the output, the input, and the modeling input. For the output first. As I said, that I want to model congestion for a neighborhood, and I want to use aggregate characteristics. So I leverage seminal work that was done by Professor here, which defined that if you have a region in a network which satisfies certain characteristics, that traffic is homogeneous and it's slowly evolving over time, there is relationships between aggregate characteristics. One such relationship is called the network exit function, and it says that there is this sort of a curve which relates the trip completion rate, which is the rate at which trips get completed in that region, to the accumulation, which is the vehicle accumulation, total vehicle accumulation in the region. So the number of vehicles that are traveling at any given time. It kind of makes sense because each link on the region has some capacity. So you can say that maybe the entire region also has some portion of capacity. So initially when the demand is low, it's able to cater to it. But then once you exceed that, everyone starts facing congestion delays, and therefore the trip completion rate then again goes down. So what I do is I just come up with a metric. So at any point of time, you're somewhere along this curve. So what I say is, you can just say what's the slope of that point, and take the inverse of that, and call it a score that you can say. This is how bad the situation is. So I call it the macroscopic congestion level, or the MCL. So now on the top, I'll refer to it as MCL. And it's basically a congestion score, a kind of congestion score. If it's high, that means you're somewhere where the trip completion rate is very low, so you're doing badly. So if MCL is low, that means you're doing well. That's the output that we want to predict. We want to predict MCL. What's the inputs that help predict this congestion score? So you're predicting congestion in a small region in the network, and then you're getting signals from the entire larger network. What kind of signals do you get? You can get the OD to map. It's not directly observable, but there's a lot of research on how to estimate it. There's the link accumulations on certain links. You can have sensors, and you can do counts, and that way you can get some link accumulation. You can get link travel times from like GPS data, GPS traces, or like maps APIs. And then you can calculate this notion of MCL, which was there in the past. You can calculate it for all the regions in the network. And that becomes useful for this specific case of where like queues can spill over from nearby regions. So if you're trying to predict congestion in a region, the congestion score in the nearby regions can be useful if congestion can spill over from those regions. So that's why that signal can also help. There's other signals which are more like priors. And I'll get to it if I get some time on how we can use them. So a lot of transportation data can be represented in the form of graphs. So the road network can be represented as a graph. Then the route choices that we do, that we make, can also be represented as a weighted graph. And there's a technique to extract features from these using this as a prior, and which leads to further improvement in the model. So if I get time, I'll get to how we can use that, but primarily I'll be focusing on the signals that I mentioned on the top. So now to find the output and the input, now the model in between. So it's basically a deep learning model that is trying to predict the MCL value in the future. So assume you're at time t, and you're measuring all these network state signals across the whole network, and you want to predict congestion score in this one particular region. What time in the future are you going to predict this score for? So we define two terms which are crucial. So first is h, which is like the minimum time that any signal takes to reach the periphery of that region that we're interested in. So a good proxy for it is like the free flow travel time from any point where we observe the signal, and we take the minimum of all those just to be safe. And then the second parameter is p, which is like a persistence, which is thing like after reaching the periphery, how much longer is that signal going to affect the congestion? So what's the maximum amount of time it's going to be there to affect congestion? So at time t, if you're trying to predict congestion, the earliest you can predict it for is t plus h, and the latest you can predict it for is t plus h plus b. So that's the range at which you want to predict. And then you want to look at the last p signal, because if you look at the latest signal, that is affected by all the signals. The earliest, that is t plus h, is affected by all these signals. So you want to incorporate all of these as well in the input. The way h is calculated, as I said, is through the free flow travel time. The way p is estimated is through something called cross-validation, where you run multiple experiments and you try to find out what's an appropriate value of p. But it's not cross-validation in the traditional sense of machine learning. So traditionally you just check for accuracy. Here we want it to be relevant for a control. So we want p to be such that your model is not just accurate, it's also like robust, it's also like far enough into the future so you can actually implement a control. So I'll mention this briefly, that p specifies how far into the future you predict. Therefore, you can actually make, you can choose p such that you make the model more robust. You can choose p such that it's a sufficient time in the future that you can implement a control. Yeah, sure.
So here you're assuming that you don't know what trips will start after t, like the future inputs into the...
You don't know what trips are going to start. And those can affect, but then you update the model at every time step.
Okay.
So that's basically the model. At time t, you're trying to predict congestion score from t plus h to t plus h plus p. So now that we define the model, now we want to test whether the model is actually viable. So there's two main conditions that we're going to test here. The first is, are we modeling the physics, or are we just overfitting the data? The second is, are the predictions better than some baseline model? So the first condition, which is, are we actually modeling the physics? It can be further divided into two categories, which, you can think of it as this. So what we have is MCL, which is kind of a proxy for the actual congestion that we want to model. And we have the inputs, which are kind of a proxy for all the different physical processes that affect congestion, like crowd shocks, spillovers, accidents. So we want to test whether the output is actually a good representation of actual congestion, and whether the input is actually sensitive to the actual processes which affect congestion. So those are the two conditions that we want to test in this overall viability condition. I'll just explain one example in which I test one particular traffic characteristic that affects congestion, and we do it for a very idealized, simple, hypothetical network. So in this case, what we want to test is, there is a case where there is congestion in a preceding link, and that affects the congestion score. So we want to test whether A, the MCL is a good representation of congestion score, and B, are the inputs sensitive to congestion on the preceding one. So the situation is very simple. There's only two zones of interest, and there's only all the traffic goes from zone A to this zone B. There's only one link inside zone A and one link inside zone B. And we want to predict congestion score in zone B. But there is this bottleneck that is just preceding zone B, which is also affecting the congestion score. And we want to see if our model is actually sensitive to the presence of the bottleneck. The demand that we assume is a sort of idealized version of what commute demand is, like goes up and then goes down. And we want to test in this scenario, A, whether the MCL is a good representation of actual congestion, and B, whether the inputs are actually sensitive to the presence of the bottleneck. Also, the fact that there is only one link in zone B, it makes it easy that we can just use traditional traffic flow theory-based models for like a particular link, and we can actually represent the congestion in the entire zone using just one link. That helps us with the analysis. So first of all, I show the cumulative input-output curve inside this zone B, this link inside zone B. This is the cumulative input-output curve when there is no bottleneck. So you see that the vertical displacement between the two curves represents the vehicle accumulation. The horizontal displacement represents the delay. Both kind of follow the sinusoidal pattern, which is first increasing and then decreasing. What you see is the MCL also follows a similar pattern. So at least this is like the first check. Now what happens when there is the bottleneck? So when there is a bottleneck, now the solid curves represent the input-output curve now in the presence of the bottleneck. What happens is, because the bottleneck is active, it can only output trips at its bottleneck capacity, which is constant. So because of that, the rate at which vehicles enter zone B is almost constant. And therefore, the accumulation and the delay is almost constant inside zone B. And we see that the MCL also reflects the same sort of pattern. It's almost flat. So at least we know that the MCL is able to represent sort of the vehicle accumulation and the delay being fixed. Now, is there something in the input that is sensitive to the bottleneck? So the input that we look at is the travel time on the link that has the bottleneck. So in the absence of the bottleneck, the travel time is just free flow travel time. But in the presence of the bottleneck, the travel time can increase. So therefore, the travel time is the signal that we can say is sensitive to the actual traffic phenomenon which is causing congestion. So this is sort of a proxy which we can probably use to predict that there's going to be some difference between that curve and that curve. We can know that that difference is going to occur based on the travel time curve. Similar to the test I just mentioned, we tested for several different possible traffic phenomena that can cause congestion. We tested for like individual OD demands, whether there's something that is sensitive to it, and whether the MCL is a good measure. We tested when demands from multiple zones can coalesce, and then how does that affect congestion? We tested the effect of route choice, effect of queue spillovers, effect of incidents. And in each case, what I did is I proved that the MCL exactly mimics the time-varying vehicle accumulation inside the zone. And also, there is at least some input which is sensitive to each of these traffic phenomena. So that way we can say that there is some confidence that this model can actually be able to model the physical process and not just be overfitting the data. The second test that we wanted to defined within this viability condition is that the predictions are good. So in the absence of any baseline, I define my own baseline. But even though I define a very simple baseline, it's actually pretty competent. So the baseline model I define is you take the congestion scores observed in the previous day, and that's your prediction for the next day. You just copy the score exactly 24 hours ago. Because of the recurrent nature of traffic, this is actually not a bad baseline model. And we wanted to see that our deep learning model actually outperforms this model in terms of prediction accuracy. So here are the results. So here what I'm showing is the root mean squared error for predicting congestion score. And I'm testing it for the exact same scenarios that I tested viability condition 1, which is where there's time varying ODs, coalescing ODs from multiple zones. There's a preceding bottleneck like I showed, route choice, queue spillover, or incidents. In each of those, I vary the demand across multiple days by a small amount. And I see that the deep learning model is able to capture the variation much better than the baseline model. So we see that, okay, there is some validity to the prediction accuracy that this model is showing. It's not like completely random. It's doing better than some baseline model. So we can say that, okay, this model, there's some confidence that we can use this model for predicting MCL. Once we're tested it for one scenario, now we want to see what if the scenarios are not as suited to the model. What if there's an adverse situation? Can the model still react to these sort of situations? I won't get into the details because of lack of time, but I'll just give a brief summary of what I did. I want to test the model in situations which are not conducive to the model, or a situation which help the baseline model and still see that our model remains relevant. So I tested for 3 scenarios. For each scenario, the goal is to see that we can actually modify the model hyperparameters or some structure or something to still make it outperform the baseline model. So the adverse scenarios that I tested is, first is correlation between OD demand. So because this scenario basically doesn't make my model worse, the deep learning model worse, but it makes the baseline model much better. Because if there's high correlation in the OD demand, that means the traffic on every single day is going to be the same. And therefore, the baseline model becomes a very good approximation. So in that case, does the deep learning model still stay relevant? So as I said before, the hyperparameter P in the model structure controls how far into the future you predict. You can also make the model more robust by saying, I'm not going to predict too far into the future because the accuracy goes down. I'll control P so that I forecast a small duration into the future. And that way I can still stay relevant. I can still outperform the baseline model and still say, okay, this model has some relevance, even when there's high correlation between these models. The second case I test is where there is noise in the input. So there's standard techniques to deal with that. You can remove the noisy variables. In deep learning literature, the other way to do it is to reduce batch size, so that way you don't, your gradients don't go too far from where they should be in every epoch. The other case that I tested, which is kind of interesting, is what happens when there is missing data. So when there is missing data, the effect actually depends on how important that variable is. So if a variable is really important and dominating at some point of time, if that data is missing at that time, we see that the accuracy just goes down, like crazy. So it's catastrophic. But the challenging part now is, how do we know which variable is important? So is there a notion that we can find out what variables are important in our deep learning model? So that leads to the next part of the topic, which is interpreting the deep learning. Then we know what's important. So neural nets have been criticized a lot for being black boxes and like not being interpretable. But for our purpose, we can actually still get a pretty good interpretation out of it. So a simple proposal is using something called an attention model, where these models are typically used is in images or like videos. When you want to caption them, you say that boy is playing with a ball. You want to know where that caption came from. So you want to know that there's some emphasis on the ball and the boy, which makes that caption happen. So that way you know what's the important portion. We apply the same technique to find out what's important in causing congestion. So what we want to do is we train the model as we would again, but now at the inference time, instead of making inference using the entire input, you constrain the input, and you see how much there is a drop in accuracy. And based on that drop in accuracy, you can say, okay, this variable that I omitted might be really important. So you can do this like for every variable at every time step, and you can get a much more richer sort of information about what variable is actually driving your prediction at any given time. So a simple framework, for example, for here I want to test whether the feature f at lag L is critical for prediction or not. So what I do is initially I predict using all my inputs, and I get some prediction. Now I constrain the input set. I say I'll only use the last L-1 lags, and I get another prediction. And then I say, what if I only use feature f at lag L and all the L-1 lags? I get some other prediction. The difference between these two losses is basically the marginal impact that feature f at lag L has. And that way you can get some notion of what's important. So I tested it for a simple scenario and a more complicated. I'll just go over the very simple scenario that I tested it for. So imagine a case where only OD demand is affecting congestion score. There's 3 OD demands, and each of those affects congestion score. So the triangular structures are the 3 OD demands, and the congestion score is in blue. So it's clear that the first OD demand affects congestion here, the second one here, the third one here. So when we apply the neural attention framework, that's what we expect to see. And that's exactly what we see. So here what I'm plotting is what's the variable importance, and we're predicting just at 6 to 8 a.m. So at 6 to 8 a.m. when you're in the first part, what you expect to see is only the zone A demand, so the first demand, to come out to be relevant. And that's what we see. The only variables that are important here are indices 0 and 3. So what 0, 1, and 2 represent is the actual demand. 3, 4, and 5 just represent the first difference. So we typically add first differences to improve the accuracy of like machine learning model. But the only variables that come out important are 0 and 3. So that's the zone A demand and the first difference in the zone A demand. So that's what we expected. We only expected zone A demand to be crucial early on. Then when we predicted for 2 to 4, we see the same effect with zone B demand. And for 8 to 10, we see the same effect with zone C demand. So it does follow intuition. So now that we have some notion, okay, we're actually modeling the physical process. We are actually better than the baseline. We can remain better than the baseline even in adverse situations. We can get some notion of how to interpret the model. But all of that is useless unless you actually make the model work. So here what I'm doing is I'm giving one case study where you can actually make use of the predictions to devise a control strategy. So the kind of predictive control that I come up with is this hypothetical scenario. Suppose everyone has a smartphone, which wouldn't be too unlikely in the near future. And every smartphone has an app, much like the ride-sharing apps that we have, but this is more for social good. So at the start of every trip, just like you enter your destination, you enter the same destination, and it spits out a route, and it spits out a price that you need to pay. But instead of the way these ride-sharing apps, they base their prices on the supply and demand of their drivers and their commuters. Here, the price is based on how much impact you're causing based on congestion. So similar to like the pay grid scenario which I mentioned earlier. Once the accident happens, your predicted impact is much higher, so you should be charged higher. That's what I want to capture here. So that's the strategy. In this strategy, now how do you come up with a good price? So formulate it as an optimization problem. The objective here is to minimize cumulative congestion score across the time period. We experimented with 1 day. But if you just want to minimize cumulative congestion, you just charge everyone infinite amount and no one will travel and like there'll be no congestion. But that's not what we want. So we say that we want to at least maintain the same overall demand probability. We'll only shift the demand over time. And based on that shift, we want to ensure that we minimize the cumulative congestion. So if we solve a convex relaxation of this problem, and the optimality condition that we come up with is that the OD demand, the effect of OD demand over space and time should be uniform. So that's the optimality condition that we get out of this. The 3 important parameters arise from solving this. The first is translation probability, which just says what is the probability for any person going from a particular origin to a particular destination. The second important parameter is what's the marginal impact of any person who reaches that destination on the congestion score. And the third is this constant of proportionality, which just converts this impact on congestion into a dollar value that you can charge. So these are the 3 parameters that you need. The problem is you don't know these in advance. You need to approximate these. So that's where deep learning comes in. So what we use is, instead of predicting MCL, now we can predict this marginal impact on congestion using the same framework that we defined. Instead of this translation probability, we have the attention values which we just defined. And the parameter that is the constant of proportionality can be treated as a hyperparameter, which is trained using cross-validation. Now this approximation is compared to another approximation where you actually just predict the demand that is going to happen, and you try to move that demand. You try to like enforce some pricing on people in order to shift that demand. So I'm comparing my deep learning approximation to a case where I'm actually assuming a particular demand curve, and I want to make changes based on that demand curve. The way I make changes is based on the optimality condition that I just mentioned, that the effect of OD demand over space and time should be constant. So I'm comparing this approximation with the approximation where I'm actually assuming that the demand curve is known. So again, I'm using the same idealized scenario where there is only OD demand which affects congestion score. And I want to see what's the impact of different tolling strategies. So first is when there is no toll, it almost remains the same. So this is one particular day. In the second case, what I'm doing is I'm assuming that I know the demand. That demand is going to be the average of all the previous day's demands that I've seen. Now when I do know that demand, now I want to shift the demand so that the effect of demand over space and time is constant. So, but what happens is the actual observed demand is not the same as the average demand. And therefore this tolling strategy sort of goes wrong. Similarly, I do the case where instead of using the average demand, I assume that whatever the previous day's demand was, that's going to happen today. And based on that, I'm going to apply a tolling strategy to make the effect of OD demand over space and time constant. So there again, it goes wrong because the last day's demand may not be the same as today's demand. That's how the deep learning model works. And this is an idealized scenario where we actually know the future demand. So when we actually know the future demand, you can still apply tolling to make sure that the effect of OD demand over space and time is as uniform as possible. So this is the numerical results. This is the objective function that we're modeling. It's the cumulative congestion score. Doesn't have much physical meaning, but there is this trend that we can see. So for no toll, it's the highest, lower for average demand, lower for last days, even lower for the deep learning model based. And then the idealized case where we do know future demands, we can achieve even better. But what actually matters is things like average travel time. And you see the same trend in average travel time. that each individual has to spend. And the deep learning model performs better than all of these naive learning strategies. And there's this idealized case where we actually know the future demand, which performs better than the deep learning model. But what's interesting is the toll that I'm actually charging. It's only reasonable for the case where, for the deep learning model. The reason being, in all the other scenarios, you're actually trying to modify the demand curve. And it's very hard to make people change where they wish to travel. You have to give them a lot of, you need to charge them a large amount of money to actually change the wished travel times. But the LSTM model, what it does is it tries to predict the impact based on congestion. And therefore, it doesn't need to shift everyone as much as the other curves. And therefore, the toll that is charged here is much more reasonable. So here, in conclusion, I show that there is actually a way in which we can use the predictions for a control strategy, and we can show that it actually works. Now, this is an advancement to the previous model. Can we do better than what we did before? Can we actually make the model predict even more accurately? So the idea here is that a lot of transportation systems produce data, and that data can be represented in the form of graphs a lot of the times. And can we use these graphs to learn something about the model? So the talk assumes that you know CNNs, but if you don't know what a CNN is, it's just a neural network architecture which is used to extract some sort of spatial features. So how important are things close by? So what it does is it looks in the locality of an input. So you have an input and it looks what's around this input in terms of space. And how instead of looking at each input within that locality, what if there is a shared effect that that locality has? So that's the purpose of using a CNN. The way it does that is through two operations. First is the convolution, which is basically an operation to introduce some sort of non-linearity into the effect. And the other is pooling, where you take the combined effect of a locality instead of each input within a locality. So that's what a CNN does. But unfortunately, the problem is that CNNs typically are only suited for a particular kind of input, which is images or videos. The special property of those inputs is they are in the form of a grid. So there is invariance in each direction. That's why you can easily apply all of these like locality sort of frameworks. But that unfortunately doesn't happen with a lot of traffic data. Traffic data can be represented in the form of graphs. Like the physical movement is constrained on the road network. So the road network is a graph there which is useful. The other is, what if there's route choice, and you want to model like the similarity between route choices, and you want to represent that as a graph. So what we can do is, we can consider two OD pairs, and we can say how similar are the routes we take. And that similarity gives us like how far these two ODs are. Therefore, it also helps us represent it as a graph. But the problem is, can we extract useful information from graphs instead of like the traditional CNN? So graph CNN is basically an extension to traditional CNN, and it's useful for extracting the same sort of spatial features that a CNN does, but it does it for a graph. So as I said, two main operations that happen for a CNN. One is convolution, one is pooling. So convolution is just like applying different functions to introduce some sort of nonlinearity. For a graph, the way you can do that is using using spectral graph theory. So what you do is you take the Laplacian of the graph and you apply Fourier transform, and you take the first k eigenvectors, and that represents the first k filters in the convolution. That's approximating the convolution. Now, how do you approximate the pooling? You can do clustering. So, like in that figure, you cluster nodes which are close to each other, and you represent them with only one node. So, as you move through the layers of a neural network, your graph becomes more and more coarse, but you get more and more convolutional filters using the Fourier transform of the graphic cluster. So that's the idea. You mimic the operation of a CNN, but you do that for a graph. So how do you define the graphs? So I define three kinds of graphs. The first is when there is no, I assume that there is no prior information. We can still form a graph out of just the input data, which is, I say that if the values of the input data are similar, that means the feature is probably similar. And therefore, those two features with very similar values should be close to each other. So that way I define one graph. The other is where I use the road network. So here what I say is each node in the road network is a node in the graph. And the shortest path between those is the distance between those nodes. The third is this trajectory clustering where, as I said, I take OD pairs and I consider those as nodes of the graph. And now I want to find the distance between these nodes. So the way I do that is I look at all the trips that have happened between these OD pairs, and I see how similar are the routes between those trips. So you can calculate similarity between two distributions using like tail divergence, and over distance, whatever. So that way you can say, okay, that's how similar the routes were, and therefore the ODs were similar. So that way I construct a different graph. For all of these, I want to compare it to several, the previous LSTM model that I just had, and I also compare it to other baseline models. So I compared it for these two scenarios. So now we consider much larger networks. One is just a simplified version of the freeway network in the Bay Area, where I predict congestion in these two zones. And the other is the full-scale network of the Bay Area, where I can predict congestion somewhere in San Francisco. So the way I generate data, I'm only modeling commute trips, and I vary the start time and the duration of the commute over the days. And based on the variations, I construct 4 scenarios. So for each of those scenarios, I want to test whether the graph CNN is actually performing better. So here are the numerical results, but I'll go to the plot which summarizes the results. So on the x-axis here, I have different scenarios. So each point here is a different scenario. The trend along the x-axis doesn't mean anything. I've just joined these lines to show which models actually clearly outperform the other. As you see, all the graph CNN's model, for all the kinds of graphs, outperform the regular LSTM model only. And those further outperform 2 baselines. One is the existing baseline that we had defined earlier, which is the last day's congestion score. And the other is this whole Winters model, which is common in statistics. It's called exponential smoothing as well. So for all of these scenarios, we see that the graph CNN actually adds some valuable information. And therefore, it produces lower root mean squared errors than the other models. So in conclusion, what I defined is that we can actually represent congestion in a region using only aggregate characteristics, which is very useful because aggregate characteristics you can track easily over time. Then once you actually represent congestion, you can even predict congestion using signals from the larger network. And a deep learning model is complex enough to be able to capture all of the given relationships that can actually affect congestion. You can make the model more robust using tuning the hyperparameters. You can interpret the model using an attention-based framework. And then I show that there's a particular case that I show where you can actually use the predictions to make to suggest a control strategy based on that, and you can show that it actually works. Lastly, I'd like to just thank my advisors, my committee members, Shelley, who's always been there, my girlfriend, and my parents. And thank you, and I'll open questions.
Did you check with other baselines, for example, like a linear model with time series? So
yeah. So Model-Predictive is like considered like the fanciest. So if you know something about time series, there's ARIMA model, the seasonal ARIMA. Model-Predictive is where you take the seasonality and you make that as a linear parameter. So you base that on some other value. So this is kind of as fancy a time series model as there is. Even like statisticians don't like old winters because we start losing interpretability of the model. So that's the most, but it turns out it's the most accurate because it's the most complex. And that's what I wanted to test it against.
So you say that you are not changing the demand, you're just modifying the demand so that it averages out.
Changing, I'm changing the schedule, yes.
Yeah, so but condition pricing may actually affect the demand. So
Yes.
how do we take care of that? I mean, how do we?
Oh, the total amount of demand.
Yeah, we don't want demand to decrease. Like,
Yeah, it's a good question. And so the ideal scenario, so this was just one case study, right? Where I assume that the demand is constant. The ideal scenario is you want a data-driven way to extract these control policies. So if the demand over multiple days changes, you want to be able to adjust your congestion price accordingly. So the way to do that is using something called reinforcement learning, where you actually modify the policy over multiple time periods. So you look at the demand over multiple days and see, okay, the demand now reduces and I didn't want that. So now you adjust the policy. So data-driven approaches and so on.
When you said it models the physics this way, what?
So what I wanted to say is what I am actually measuring is this congestion score. What I actually want to measure is actual congestion. So does the congestion score actually represent congestion well? The second thing is I am actually looking at these signals from the network which are observable. But the factors that actually affect congestion may not be observable. Things like route choice, queue spillovers and all that. So is this input actually sensitive to the factors which actually cause congestion? So these two factors, if they're satisfied, and you can say that, okay, if there is a physical process that is actually affecting congestion, my proxies would be sensitive to that. That's the best you can ensure.
But the deep learning model itself and
Yeah.
how it
Yeah.
that is
thing-
not interpretable.
Yeah. So that you don't try to like look into the deep learning model and see that okay, this physical phenomenon was affecting it this way, and therefore the deep learning model weight should be this. That would be like you'll have to analyze like millions to do that. So the things that are within our control are the input and the output, and that's what we want to be like reactive. Yeah.
Usually we like to use deep learning for tackling the problem of dimensionality. Where does dimensionality come in?
So the dimensionality is huge in this framework. So if we go back to the input, yeah. So that's the input to our models. The OD demands can be huge. Those are in the order of squared number of regions or the combination. So then the link counts can be as many links as you have sensors. So yes, you want to, so there's a very high dimensionality, and therefore the training can get really screwed up. The way you tackle that, one of the ways you tackle that is you use priors. So that's what I do when I use the graph CNN. So what that does is it requires much less data. You already ensure some sort of structure. And now whatever input you see, you filter it through this prior. And therefore you need much less data to actually infer like good predictions. Yeah.
You said one application is dynamic condition pricing. Are there any other applications for this model?
Yeah, you can have like so people have used it for like cordon metering, like how many people you let in to a zone. You can like say that how many people you allow on the highways. You can basically right now with this framework you have the freedom of like implementing control wherever in the network. So that's the benefit because we're looking at citywide scales of inputs. So you can pick and choose where you whichever part of the network you want to control, and you can think of like a control that makes you the predictions from the thing.
I also have a question about the baseline. So I was trying to think about, or trying to understand what might be the state of art in this area of congestion management.
Yeah.
In terms of a model to predict congestion, for which you could use some control methodology. And the way I understood the baseline that you had, I think you labeled it as 1NN.
Yeah, it's just the last
is like a persistency model,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Is that the state of the art in terms of models for congestion management?
I mean, so that's why, because there is no state of the art, this was a simple yet like intuitive and competent model because of the recurrent pattern. In like traditional time series, you use things like ARIMA or like exponential smoothing, but the idea is there is no existing baseline. But you can improve upon any baseline in the future. So when anyone now does congestion modeling, they can compare against a graph CNN LSTM model and say that, okay, that's the baseline now. So the idea is over time, you can improve, you can come up with baseline and you can improve the state of the art. So yeah, I would love to know like if there's other baselines that compare well against the graph CNN LSTM model. And if they are better, then that should be considered baseline when any new researcher comes in, tackle congestion prediction. So yeah, it should be just like collaborate and then like improving the baseline. Is that, oh, did I?
One last question.
One last question, yes. Sure.
So, you mentioned the spatial correlation study conflicts economy and there are also casino. And your understanding is that, for example, you have input condition here and affect the results of the connection.
Yeah.
At that.
Well, first it will affect close by and then later on, like, it would, yeah. It diminishes farther, yeah. That is why we want CNNs, is because we want a data-driven way to say how far it influences. With just a heuristic-based model, you would only be coming up with, okay, let me consider the nearest 2 links or nearest 4 links. But then that might not work from one region to another. That's why you use CNNs, which say, okay, if there's a relationship here in this region, which is 2 regions away, we'll do that. And if it's 4 regions away here, then we'll do that. So that's what the CNN is for. It's like to extract like different kinds of spatial patterns in different parts of the network.
Yeah, so would it make sense if the influence of this zone comes from very far?
It can, yeah, I mean, it's possible because, for example, in the Bay Area, there are people who commute from like Berkeley to like Silicon Valley every day. There's like buses that Google runs that, so Google bus, if I'm not wrong, it's like the 2nd largest like public transportation. And that runs like really long distances. There's a really so far off, but very strong correlation between like people living in like San Francisco versus Silicon Valley, something like that.
Would you see that in the
It's possible. I haven't checked into it.
Check the weight.
Yeah, I should check. Oh yeah, check the weights to see if there's some correlation. Yep. Thank you.